Welcome to Unmasked, where we take off the filters and get real about faith, failure, and finding freedom. I'm your host, Wesley Farnsworth, a dad, veteran, author, and a man who's learned that God does his best work in the middle of our mess. Each episode will have honest conversations with people who've walked through addiction, pain, or doubt, and with pastors, leaders, and everyday believers who are learning to live and lead authentically. So take a breath, pull up a chair, and let's get real. This is Unmasked. Today on Unmasked, we're taking a closer look at the intersection of faith, mental health, and real-life transformation. My guest, Patrick Eilers, is a licensed professional counselor from Michigan who has been helping individuals, couples, and groups find hope and healing since 2016. Patrick's experience spans anxiety, depression, and addiction recovery, along with several years specializing in sexual addiction treatment. He's also a certified professional life coach through the American Association of Christian Counselors and a founder of Bloomworks Concepts and Coaching, where he guides people and organizations towards emotional and spiritual wellness. Patrick brings not only clinical expertise, but also a heart for integrating faith, psychology, and practical growth. We'll be talking about mental health, recovery, and how Christian counseling can help people move from surviving to thriving. Patrick, welcome to Unmasked.
Thanks, Wesley. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. Thanks so much for having me. And yeah, I think it's going to be a great opportunity for us to talk about some of those things you just mentioned.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this conversation since you agreed to come on the show because, I think it's something that there's still a little bit of a stigma around mental health and
absolutely,
and dealing with things like anxiety and depression and even sexual addiction and things like that. So it's great to have somebody that can come in and speak to a little bit about that. So let's just start right off. Why do you think there's a stigma still around mental health, and even within the church where people are, or within the faith, where people are afraid that going and getting help may reflect negatively on them in some way? Why do you think that is, and what advice would you give to people that are considering getting help?
Yeah, that's a question that comes up a lot in a lot of different conversations I've had with people, and I really appreciate kind of how you framed it. There's some stigma that's definitely in the general population, but then there's also a stigma within the church. I think, one of the things from the church perspective, I would say, is that it seems like there is I use a thermometer. It's kind of a temperature gauge of, when we have mental health issues, it's sort of a temperature gauge of how well we're doing in our faith walk. And I was on a podcast about a month and a half ago, maybe or so. We talked about same kind of thing, same kind of question came up, why is there such a stigma around mental health in the church? And I think the church does some areas very, very, very well when it comes to relationships, when it comes to connection with people. Obviously, there's certainly some levels of that are very strong with the church. But when it comes to mental health, there's a little bit of mystery there. There's, like I said, there's definitely a piece of it that seems to be tied back to how well you're doing with your relationship with Christ. And so because of that, if you're not able to sort of navigate your mental health on your own, then that must be a reflection of how much faith you have or lack of faith or whatever, however we want to phrase that. In the general population, I think there's sort of, again, back to kind of a Western sort of perspective, is that in general, people feel like if they're not strong enough to navigate their own issues and things that are going on, that they've somehow failed, right? They failed themselves, they failed the loved ones, whatever the case is. And so a lot of people will tend to sort of, just continue to hold those things in, hold them in until they can't do that anymore, until it starts to kind of come out in some ways, right? It usually shows up in either unhealthy behavior or unhealthy relationships or unhealthy, lack of connection would be one of those ways, kind of turning into yourself. Now, some of those things are functionable. There's certainly an aspect of that, both within the church and without the church. We can function to some degree in a lot of different ways, but that doesn't mean we're thriving. And I think one of the things that, in the Bible very consistently is the fact that God wants us to continue to be growing, not only as people, but also just as individuals, sort of for the greater community, right? The greater sense of not only the people that we're working with in the church, but also that we navigate everyday life with. So I think there's certainly an aspect of that, like, our mental health is directly tied back to not only our physical health, but also just in general, like the best sort of version of ourselves. It's a little bit of a cliche saying these days, but being that person is really about thriving in that space. And life is not going to always have those moments where there's going to be great moments all the time, right? There's going to be a lot of challenge, and it says, Jesus says that there's going to be trials and tribulations for us, regardless of whatever era we've lived in time. There's always things that are going to be part of that. So I do think mental health from a perspective in the church is something that, is getting a more traction in it, but it's still definitely something that, there's a lack of conversation around it, lack of understanding around it. And like I said, I think that certainly people think it's a reflection of their faith walk.
Yeah, I can totally see that. So, I mean, I myself, I'm in counseling, and I absolutely love it. And because it gives you a safe place to be able to share things. But
Absolutely.
I remember when I was first starting out, I wasn't all in. I was very guarded. I didn't want to share things. And so, what advice would you give to somebody that is maybe considering counseling, or maybe they're just
Yeah.
starting and they're kind of in that point where they're like, I don't know if it's safe to share, or,
Mhm.
you know, is the advice or the feedback that this counselor is going to give me, is it going to be worth my time being here? What advice would you give to that person?
Yeah, there's so many different stories you hear as a therapist, and a lot of them are not very good. So I don't say that to be negative to people who are listening, but certainly the idea that there is a lot of scary stories for folks as much as there are success stories. And it's about finding, number one, I think finding a person who aligns with what you feel like you align with, right? So I say like that, when you're talking about Christian counselors specifically, right? Having that worldview is important, right? If you're somebody who isn't a believer, it might be a little bit different. Maybe you're looking more for a certain style or whatnot, but every therapist is different. So I always encourage people who've never done it before that to definitely give it an opportunity, because it doesn't necessarily happen overnight. You have to give that, 10 I usually kind of say 10 to 15 session mark before you start to really kind of know how well you're going to work with somebody. Now, some people would click quicker and certainly click faster and certainly work together in a quicker way. For me personally, I always like to make sure that everybody walks away with something practical that they can focus on. For me, the way I look at therapy is that it's an opportunity. And so as long as the door is closed, an opportunity to investigate, not only your life, but also investigate what's happened before. Maybe it was something as recent as the last week, could have been something as, as far back as maybe it was in your childhood. But the reality is that as a therapist, I'm there to facilitate an opportunity with you coming in. And so really it's about, I think, does a therapist give the space for a client to be able to come in and be able to grow? So that's, do you feel like you're learning and growing in that opportunity? If you're not, then having the therapist, or asking the therapist to help you along those areas where you are struggling. If that's practical application tools, if it's understanding yourself better, if it's reflecting things, whatever it might be, really being kind of communicative. The second thing would be like really communicating with the therapist. So understanding first, are they in alignment with yourself, and kind of second, do they communicate well with you? Do you communicate well with them? Even if it's not really deep stuff, or you feel like you're connecting with them as a person. And then maybe the third part, I guess I would say, is that, for people who are hesitant in it, it's something, because there's an opportunity, it's not going to be easy for you to necessarily come in and always feel like it's your, I want to say responsibility, because it is. I think there's a percentage of responsibility at different periods in the process where the therapist is going to do more than the client, and vice versa. Right at the beginning, it was a lot more of the therapist trying to kind of get the person more comfortable. But as you develop that rapport, then it's more of their responsibility to do more with the therapist. So again, like that communication is really important. If you don't like something about that, talk to the therapist about that. If you like something that you've done, talk to your therapist about that. Like those are the things that kind of start building the bridges to start having better rapport. I think one of the most challenging pieces is when you have somebody comes in and they say, well, I don't know what to do differently, or I don't know what to change. I just know something's wrong. And you spend a lot of time trying to figure out what that means for that person, whatever it might be. And then they acknowledge that, and then they just kind of like leave it there, right? They're sort of like, oh yeah, I'm struggling with this type of behavior, but then they don't want to make any changes to it. And then you have to start kind of getting an understanding, okay, why don't you want to make those changes, and what's keeping you held back, and that kind of thing. So as a therapist, there's lots of different ways that, sure, there's sort of different ways we can do that. But then at the same time, we're also limited to what we're given. So I always tell people that in that opportunity, you're only going to take away what you're going to put in. And so when the door closes, that's your opportunity. And when the door opens and you go back into your life, how are you taking those other 23 hours and applying it to that 1 hour you just spent with the therapist? Because a lot of your life happens outside the therapy room. Like I said, the opportunity is only for that one particular hour. So I don't know if that encourages people, but I would say that, hopefully people have a greater understanding of kind of where they're part of their responsibility and a therapist's responsibility kind of coming into the process.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, a lot of people I know, they're like, well, I go and and he doesn't ever give me anything. And I've talked to people where I'm like, well, what did you give them? Because that's something that I've learned is, you only get out of it what you put into it. And so when I was not putting anything into it, I wasn't really getting anything out of it.
Absolutely.
And the more that I've been open and honest and just shared everything, the more I've been able to get valuable feedback. So I appreciate that feedback from you there.
Yeah, and if I can add to that as well, one of the things, and I'm going to cut you off, but just one of the things that,
Okay.
one of the things that comes up a lot of times when you say that is I've had people say, I want to come in and I just, it's almost like the expectation that I'm going to have some kind of wisdom that they don't have. And a lot of times, like, you're the expert of your own life. So whatever it is that's going on in your life, you know far a lot more about it than I do. And so if you come in and the expectation is I'm going to give you something that's going to kind of blow your mind, that doesn't usually happen right off the bat. Like it's very hard to kind of get those like immediate things because you probably already tried a lot of those things. And kind of back to the first question, why is there stigma? Well, sometimes I think it's because people feel like, well, what's the point in coming to talk about something that I've already tried to change and it hasn't changed? And it's really more about the process of connecting with another person and getting an opportunity. Again, like I said, really therapy being an opportunity to grow from those things that maybe you didn't handled the best way, or maybe you did handle it really well, but the result was not what you wanted. So to that point, same kind of thing, it is about how much you're gonna put in order for you to be able to get what you would equal like out of it. And that's not easy to do. And it's not easy to do in a very short time. Like that's something it takes, patience and really kind of continuing to build rapport with a person before you start to see that kind of sort of take off in that way.
Yeah, yeah. It's therapy is not a magic pill. You don't go in for an hour and you come out all better.
Yep.
It takes time and practice and commitment.
The discipline.
Discipline, yes, there you go. That works too. So, Christians, I think, and this is really just people in general, but one of the things that I know people really deal with are things like anxiety and depression. And I think that's both in and out of the church. Those are just common, everyday human feelings and things that we struggle with. So can you give us some takeaways, some things that people can use if these are things that they're dealing with, and you can do them one at a time if that's what you want to do,
Okay.
that they can use to kind of attack those two areas, anxiety and depression, both from maybe a clinical standpoint and then a faith standpoint as well.
Okay. Yeah, and I think with those particular two as well, they tend to sort of kind of go hand in hand. Sometimes you could argue, well, depression starts and that creates anxiety, or anxiety starts and that creates depression. Depends on the person, really. But you'll see a lot of those kind of coincide with one another. Typically, when you're looking at depression as a diagnosis, they won't necessarily have a direct link to anxiety, meaning that it's not one of the symptoms, but it's like one of the secondary symptoms almost of that. Usually, you typically see that. So, from like a biblical perspective, I guess the first thing I would say is, it's really about mindset. And this is an area where the Bible talks about over and over again what we're focusing on. Anxiety tends to do, in my experience, one of two things, right? Either tends to take us in the past, when we kind of past trip, we go back in time and we ruminate, we think about all the things we could have done, what we could have done differently, and there's a real focus on regret and kind of focus on what we didn't do. Why didn't God allow this thing to happen? Why didn't God bring this relationship? Et cetera, those kind of things. Or you're really focusing on the future. And so if you're focused on the future, it's what's going to happen. Is the end times here? What's going on with all the world around us? Am I going to get injured? Am I going to get hurt? Obviously, we saw during the pandemic, people felt like their health was in danger. There's a lot of things sort of that's a future focused kind of mindset. So really, the thing I always encourage people to do from a practical perspective is, one of the things is to slow down so you're staying more present. So the number one area that I typically will encourage people is in the area of grounding, which is really to kind of walking through your senses. And so the grounding exercises are very simple. You can kind of do them anywhere. You can do them at work. You can do them at home. And so basically taking the five senses that we have. So basically 5 things that we can see, what are 5 things in the environment that we're in? What are 4 things that we could touch? What's the texture around us? Those kind of things, tactile type things. What are 3 things that we could hear? What are 2 things that we could smell? What's 1 thing we could taste? And so what that does is a lot of times, my experience, a lot of the anxiety kind of loops, right? It's like a train on a track. It just kind of keeps going around and around. And the grounding exercises really put a little break in that in the track so that the train doesn't keep going, around in circles, and it brings you more back to more like present focus. And so from a biblical perspective, being more present focused is really about, knowing that we're not guaranteed the next day, we're not guaranteed the next minute, we're not guaranteed the next breath. So how can we focus more on being here rather than being in the past or in the future? It seems that certain people navigate that differently. Some people definitely are future focused and their fear is what's going to happen. And there seems to be a lot of people who are focused on kind of what the past was. I know for me personally, I tend to lean more toward my concerns about the past. I sort of I feel like I try to take a wash rag of my information and knowledge and try to wring as much as I can out of it. And I always want to try to make sure I'm gaining a little bit of wisdom I could from that. But sometimes it can go too far, right? Sometimes you can focus too much on that particular area and you lose sight of everything else. So anxiety really is about kind of, again, not being future focused, not being past focused, but trying as much as you can to be in the present. And that's more about, communicating with God, praying, keeping yourself really grounded in the reality and the truth of where we're at, in this moment as we're talking. Depression, from a symptomology perspective, you're going to see a little more of low mood. You're going to see a little more of, sometimes suicidal ideation happens. I wouldn't say that's relatively like highly common. It does happen, but it's not usually one of the main, in my experience, it's not what, I mean, I'd probably say less than 50%, but more than like 25% of the time. That's for folks. You'll see, weight loss, weight gain if you're not eating. So you lose a lot of self-care. That happens. Hypersomnia or insomnia is part of that as well. Again, going back to self-care. But really loss of interest of things is kind of the main predominant, symptom people have. So when you have that, typically people, again, going back to kind of like a biblical perspective is that, is our mission going to be on point with what God has for us? Our calling, so to speak. So I go back to like that idea of like, if I'm a person who struggles finding my passion or finding my purpose in that sense, in my sort of pie of life of all the different things that are going on, how can I revisit that every day? What gets me up every day that I can start moving toward that? And letting that be sort of my focus, to guide me and move me toward that direction. So I think from a biblical perspective, you could say that, well, it's also partially as well understanding that, there is a season of sadness and there's a season of grief for people, and understanding that those seasons come and go. That, like I said earlier, life is going to have a variety of different seasons in it. And we're not necessarily going to be, sort of camped in one or the other. We're always kind of moving forward. And so how do we allow ourselves to start to get focused more on sort of our purpose in that aspect? And then also doing good self-care, taking care of ourselves so we can give back to the people in our lives, our community, our family, our church, whatever it is. I think a lot of times, especially people in the church as well, like if they don't say no, no is an okay thing to say sometimes. That's a good boundary to have. And so if you don't say no, you can empty your cup really quickly. And so the way I think about it is that if I have a cup that gets empty, so to speak, then what's filling it back up? And something's going to fill it back up, even if it's a short-term thing. So this is where you see like some addictions will pop up because those give kind of short-term relief. Or it might be something more long-term where it's just kind of dripping, but it's not really helping a person necessarily, fill it back up in a way that's productive. So, again, obviously there's a relationship there with God that, can help fill some of that as well. But I think there has to be a variety of different things that kind of work to fill that cup back up so that you have enough to pull back, to empty out for other people to be able to care for others. So kind of back to that idea, I think that, there's certainly some things there with anxiety, but also, like I said, filling your cup up for depression in that sense, and kind of, we can find that balance is a big piece of it.
Yeah. When you mentioned addiction there for a minute, and let's detour just a little bit here into this realm for a minute. I'm very active in a ministry called Celebrate Recovery, and we deal,
Yep.
we deal with addictions and all kinds. So what would you say to somebody that is maybe they're in an addiction of some kind and they're in the throes of it and they can't figure out how to get out? They're struggling with it. They've tried everything that they can think of. Maybe they're just coming up blank with new ways to try it. What advice would you give to that person in order to help them maybe find some freedom?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is I think, 12-step programs and programs like Celebrate Recovery and those kind of things are a great start because it gives you an opportunity to let somebody else know about it, right? Most people feel like if they're in addiction, they're the only person that's struggling with it. They tend to sort of isolate depending on the behavior. Things like alcohol and drugs tend to be a little more social, but certainly gambling, pornography, those kind of secret ones that you can do on your phone or, kind of keep secret from people, it tends to be a lot, very isolating in that sense. So the first thing I'd say is really, can you find somebody, even if it's a therapist or it's anybody else, that you can kind of start to let a little bit of that out, being able to talk a little more about it, not from a perspective of maybe sharing everything, but certainly spending some time to be a little bit of it here and there so you can start to connect with people. Because the more isolated you are, the more likely you're going to continue to do it. Another thing I can think of that I think is important, and I've shared this in our podcast with people too, is that it's about identifying boundaries and identifying places of safety for yourself. One of the things when I worked with pornography, people struggle with pornography. A lot of times people would say, "Well, I just wish it would just go away." And I've said that I can understand that completely, but at the same time, it's not going to. So we have to work around how can we do that. And one of the analogies I used to use was Back to the Future 3. In the scene where they're pushing the DeLorean with the train, there's a windmill in that model that Doc builds of the whole that was tested out through a model. And the one sign says point of no return. And Marty says to Doc, well, why is that? What's with the windmill? And Doc's like, well, we have up until that point to stop the train and stop the DeLorean. But if we pass this windmill, we're going to go over the cliff. So I think about that from a perspective of in our lives, we all have windmills. So relapses occur because people are not aware of their windmills. And their windmills could be an emotion, their windmill could be an event, their windmill could be a relationship, their windmill could be a lot of different things. And gaining self-awareness of knowing, and this is where therapy comes into play, knowing where those windmills are so you don't cross them will help you be able to navigate relapses, navigate ongoing addiction behavior, because you'll know, hey, when this thing happens, 98% of the time I tend to go past that windmill, I act out, whatever that is, wherever you, like I said, anything you're choosing to do. So I think that's one thing, is identifying kind of where your windmills are. And then the secondary part with that is then also identifying boundaries that are healthy for you and for devices particularly. The phone has become one of our probably the most intimate device, if not the most intimate relationship we have with another object, so to speak, right? The phone goes to the bedroom, the phone goes to the bathroom, the phone goes places that other people and other things are not allowed to go to. And so the reason that a lot of people have ongoing acting out is because they don't put distance in with their phone. They don't put enough distance with their computer. They don't put enough distance with other things that allow that, so that it has access everywhere. And that's where a lot of times it tends to escalate, especially with pornography. You don't necessarily always see people viewing things that are more outrageous or maybe more perverse, so to speak, but they tend to sort of watch more of whatever they were previously watching. That does happen quite often. So that starts to really eat into their functioning. If like you're only watching 5 minutes a day, that's different than what, and then all of a sudden you find yourself watching 25, 30, 40 an hour. It kind of builds like that. So part of it's also adapting those good boundaries where you have separations from, especially from devices, but really some separations from anything that's going to keep you distracted. Going back to a biblical perspective, it's all about mindset, right? What are we focusing on? Are we focusing on God? Are we focusing on our relationship with Him and those kind of things?
Yeah. And I like that you brought up the intimacy of a phone and how it impacts our lives. I think more and more there's new things coming to the surface that people are struggling with, especially when you think of things like doom scrolling,
AI.
and AI, but I'm thinking specifically right this moment just of doom scrolling. Phones they're a part of our lives. We can't get rid of them. They're the necessary evil, if you will. So what advice would you give somebody that is, maybe they're trying to stop doom scrolling so much, but they can't get rid of their phone and still be able to operate? I mean, it's just, like I said, it's a necessary evil now. So what advice would you give that person to maybe be able to limit or reduce the number of hours that they spend doom scrolling now?
Yeah. I think one of the biggest things is just slow introduction. I think, setting a timer for 5 minutes and just doing something else other than that, right? Finding, rediscovering the things you like doing, rediscovering and reading, rediscovering whatever it is that's not digital. I know there's so much that is digital, and that's going back to some other things as well, like creating false intimacy, creating, spaces for us that that's, social media is all about creating a space for us to share part of our life, but it isn't really an honest part of our life most of the time. And so really it's about trying to, I think, the slow introduction. So slow, 5 minutes here to 10 minutes here, and kind of building up that muscle, so to speak, of getting more comfortable not having the phone nearby. The other thing I'd say is having a physical location for the phone. So when you're at home, if the phone has a space where it is, a garage, so to speak, where it goes, rather than necessarily having just being put in your pocket and following you around it. Part of the intimacy of it is because it has access to go to, like, it just gets put in our pants, or it gets, put in our coat pocket or whatever. And so because of that, I think that's a big part of the reason why that intimacy tends to grow, because, if you go to the bathroom, people are like, why does I have my phone in my pocket? I wasn't even thinking about it. It's that inability to be intentional that I think causes a lot of these boundaries to get sort of crossed. So what we typically see is that these boundaries are crossed not because necessarily the person is intentionally trying to cross them. It's because they accidentally put themselves, or they weren't thinking about I would say accidentally, I guess, inadvertently were crossing a boundary they weren't aware of and they weren't maintaining as being kind of concrete there. Meaning that there's a definitive yes and no to it. Meaning I know that I cannot have the phone in the bathroom, for example. The phone doesn't go there regardless of whatever the problem is, whatever excuse I can come up with. The phone just doesn't go in the bathroom, as an example. But so basically, I think it's a slow introduction of that, like, slowing yourself to, small amounts, but also going back to, like I said before, about being more present in the here and now, engaging with the people around you, engaging, if you're single, engaging with, activities and things you enjoy doing that you can find purpose to. Because the more doom scrolling is one of those kind of escapism type behaviors. And you see this very commonly with like pornography as well. Like, people just trying to escape what they're feeling. They don't like what they feel. They feel bored, whatever the case is. They feel anxious, back to anxiety, people feel depression, whatever it is. And so they use those behaviors as a way to escape it. So if we don't acknowledge that we're feeling that way, then we're bound to continue to repeat that behavior because it's what we make is our normal. And when we make that normal be part of what we're doing every day, then yeah, it's gonna be really hard for us to break from that. Part of it is, I think, yes, so slow and reduction is one part, definitely having those boundaries in our part. And then maybe the third part to think about with that is just identifying those feelings that cause that doom scrolling, and identifying why doom scrolling is a way that I've navigated ignoring maybe those are feelings, even if it's just boredom. I mean, boredom is a feeling to some degree. We need to that's an area where we need to refocus, right? We need to, read, or we need to engage in some way. Our brain's having a hard time, finding something to engage with. So, and I think that the phone has amplified that for everybody. And not everybody has ADHD right now, but certainly there's a lot more people who see it because we're symptoms related to the phone.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think people struggle with is just figuring out how to change their mindset. You said something a couple minutes ago, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but it kind of brought to mind this idea that, people are, they'll take their phone to the bathroom for, let's just say, because they're afraid that so-and-so is going to call. And if they don't answer the minute that they call, then somebody else that person's going to think negatively of them. Or, if their boss calls and they don't answer the phone, then something's going to happen. And I think, in some cases, that is actually the case, because people are in this instant gratification, instant satisfaction mindset that if I call somebody, they have to answer, or they're just dodging my call, or, whatever. And so how would you go about beginning the process of changing that mindset that, it's okay for me to not answer the call, and it's okay for somebody to not answer my call right away if maybe they're the employer that's where they find themselves thinking all the time.
And you see this quite often within the realm of how people feel about themselves. Certainly, like you said, boundaries toward work, boundaries toward, people, kind of instant gratification, that sense of that. And there's probably a part of that that's true. The other one I hear a lot is fear of missing out, which I have a hard time kind of fully wrapping my mind around, because again, other people are doing and living their life. I mean, I can't control those things, right? Whether or not they invite me or they don't, kind of thing. But I can understand why people would be nervous about that. But I think one aspect of it, kind of to what you're saying, is part of, recognizing that whether or not if I don't take care of myself, if I don't have those boundaries in place, if I don't give work, if I don't leave work at work, is a very common saying people try to do, right? And if I don't break from some of these things, I'm going to get consumed by them, because I don't have a space where I'm putting things to protect myself, so to speak. A fence protects our yard from other people entering our yard, so to speak, or our property line keeps people from crossing into our property. And if we don't have that in ourselves, it's kind of like there's a verse talks about basically if the walls of the city are down, everybody has access to it. And it's not directly related specifically to this topic, but certainly in the idea that if you don't have a wall around the city, people are going to be able to enter it at their own will. And I think when you don't have those good boundaries in that way, you don't have the boundary from work, you don't have the boundary from your family in a healthier way, those kind of things, you don't do things to recharge like we were talking about earlier, then you're bound to let more people in that are either unhealthy or let people take things from you to some degree, your internal energy, your time, etc. And that's going to be detrimental to you. So are you willing to feel, I don't say selfish, because I know a lot of people feel it's selfish, but if you're not willing to feel like if you're not willing to accept kind of the space of, okay, I need to have these things for other to be, have the strength to be able to help other people and build those boundaries to some degree, I'm probably always going to be allowing other people to steal that part of me. So it's really about, I think there's a part of it where the mindset shift is, self-care is really, I've seen this cliche saying and I don't want to use it, but I will. Self-care is self-love, which I'm not really big on, because self-love is very, that to me is more selfish than necessarily self-care. Self-care is, I would say, is maintaining, it's maintenance, it's self-maintenance. It's allowing yourself an ability to be able to be the healthiest version of you, or to be able the most complete version of yourself. And part of that self-care is taking care of your relationship with Christ. That's a big part of it. That is a very big self-care piece for people who are, faith-based, because that relationship is what's going to sustain us. It's, back to the idea, Jesus is the well, right? We're thirsty. We need the water. If we don't have that, then, what are we going to fill it up with? Typically, as human beings, that's where our nature starts to come in, and we're going to probably jump into something that's much more unhealthy for us.
Yeah. And, I think when it comes to faith, people that are struggling with addictions or self-image or, anything like that are essentially worldly, one of the things that happens is maybe they overcome it and then they struggle with the ability to be able to forgive themselves, and, Christ has already forgiven them. He died on the cross for the sins, and I think they know that, but then the flesh, we have a very hard time forgiving ourselves for doing
Absolutely.
what we knew was wrong in the first place. And so that prevents people from being able to be used by God to be able to tell their story to other people or whatever it might be. So what would you say to the person that maybe that's where they're at right now? They've overcome something, but that shame, that guilt, that inability to be able to forgive themselves is still very prevalent in their lives. What would you say to that person?
Yeah. I think the first place is that that forgiveness, whether it be to ourselves or to for other people, is a process. We tend to look at forgiveness a lot. I think it's starting to change a little bit, but certainly growing up as a kid, in the church in different areas that I was experienced, my faith, when I was younger, is that forgiveness always kind of have this mentality of being a one-time thing. I accept forgiveness to person A, I offer forgiveness to person B, whatever. And so because of that, it's like, well, if I forgive them, then I don't feel, right? That's kind of almost the response. Like, is that if I forgive them, then I just don't have any, sort of response to it. At least that's how my perspective growing up was. But I think as a therapist, I've kind of seen that, forgiveness is a process, number one, even to ourselves, right? Like if I'm not willing to say, okay, this is who I used to be, and it's going to get to my second part, but really kind of taking on a new identity, which is what Christ, says that we do. Paul talks about that idea that we're taking on the image of Christ, as believers. Part of the unforgiveness or part of the forgiveness struggle I think people have is then say, okay, this is a process. It might not be, tomorrow that I'm going to forgive myself, or 3 days from now, or a week from now, or a year from now, but continuing to do that over and over again, saying, I know that I know I'm taking on this new identity as a child of God. And I think that's the secondary part, is really believing. So knowing the mental space of that and, believing in your heart is tend to be very different in the sense that I know that my identity is in Christ. Like we talked about, you were mentioning, people know they're forgiven, but do people really believe they're forgiven? And I think that that's really where it's that crossing of the bridge of going, okay, I know I'm forgiven, but now I believe it, and I'm going to carry that out in my identity. And that doesn't mean that our flesh isn't going to tempt us. It doesn't mean that our flesh is going to, because I've had questions before, people ask, like, do you think that relapse can be completely eliminated? I think it can be eliminated if we continue to live in that identity. I think it also can be eliminated if we continue to make healthy decisions in our boundaries. But can we go back to that behavior? Absolutely. As long as we're on the earth, we definitely have the ability to do that. So that means that all these things that we may overcome in ourselves, I think our nature still is at the door knocking just as much as God is at the door knocking. Jesus said, and so which door are we going to answer? And so, some days it's easier to answer the door with Jesus and say, okay, hey, we're inviting you in and being in our space. And your intro talked about, God does his best work in sometimes the most, ugliest mess, so to speak. But then there's other times where it's a lot easier for us to knock, the door of sin is knocking in there, and we like to open that door. And so I think it's a process of, what's going to become more consistent? What are we going to continue to turn toward? Or is that relationship with God going to be more important no matter what we might get out of our own sin nature? That I keep turning back to him. And I do think that's part of the part of the walk of being a believer, is that you're always kind of battling those two things. And we always have opportunities just as much to answer the door that Jesus is behind, as much as we have the door, as much as we have time to answer the door of sin. And so part of it, that forgiveness process and that identity piece is, I think, those are kind of go hand in hand there.
Yeah. And, I think there's another side of the coin to this that I think we should touch on just briefly. Is, people, maybe they've not had any issues forgiving themselves, but maybe they're having a trouble forgiving somebody else for something that they've done to them, or they've forgiven them. They say that they think they've forgiven them, but they still wake up every day thinking about this thing that they did or whatever, and they just can't seem to move past it. what advice would you give to somebody in that situation?
Well, there might be some more of the wound that needs to be addressed. I think there's certainly that aspect of it. Like, there may be, if they're having a hard time letting that go, like, I don't want to say letting it go, but certainly having a hard time being able to process it and accept it kind of thing and move forward. So there might be a wound there. It certainly needs, again, warranted more exploration, whether through a journal, whether through prayer, whether through therapy, however you would like to, sort of acknowledge that. I think that's a part of it. The other thing I guess I'd say with that too is that, is this unforgiveness moving me toward being, more toward healing, and this me thinking about is helping me grow, or is it really kind of keeping me stuck? I think a lot of times the more we're stuck, the more likely that it's going to be resentment, those kind of things. A good exercise, and I recommend for this people, if people have gone through grief or they feel like they haven't had a chance to say something to somebody in a certain way, is to write a letter. So they use this in grief exercise a lot, is to write a letter to the person who passed away or the person who's no longer in my life, whatever. You could kind of tweak that and say, write a letter to the person who's who you don't feel you can forget. And so write that letter, and then you're not sending that letter. You're not going to even let anybody else read it, maybe, but pray on it and look at it, and look at the emotions and look at the processing and see what you're taking away from after writing it, because maybe that will give you an insight to go, because here's some reasons why I'm not forgiving this person. And then kind of consulting with either a friend or somebody you trust or a therapist or whoever, to kind of help guide in some of those feelings. I think the more that we ruminate on something, the more we tend to sort of feel like that's we kind of talked about earlier, the more you focus on that mindset, the more likelihood that's where your brain's going to go. In a lot of ways, God made us a really wonderful sense that, we were able to really adapt to healthy things. But when we tend to be in unhealthy spaces, we tend to have a much harder time breaking from those because of the way our body's designed. And so part of that mindset shift is understanding and acknowledging what those feelings are, and then being able to say, okay, where some of these wounds are still coming from that maybe I didn't get a chance to, feel or experience, in the process here myself, or in the process of healing, or in prayer, or wherever that may be. So hopefully that answers the question. But I think forgiveness is a very tricky topic as far as like, what's the practical things to do if you can't forgive? Like, I think it's a lot harder to, it's easy for me to kind of come in here and give you kind of sort of ambiguous answers, but that's sort of the reality of forgiveness. I mean, it is kind of a bit of a mystery in that sense. Like, we all sort of have an idea of what it is, but to really see it played out is really about kind of, what's our behavior? I really think, I mean, ultimately, what's our behavior and what's our internal thought life, about that. And I think that's where you see that happen. There's a lot of different things over the last probably year and a half I've seen about, like, part of the forgiveness that God gives us. And then it talks about if you're unwilling to forgive, then how can God forgive you, kind of thing. And that's sort of in that same space. Am I willing to forgive people? Am I continue to work toward that? Or am I just kind of hardening my heart and not letting that go, kind of thing, in that way?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've seen recommended too, is, when you write those letters, is I've heard people say, well, I'm not comfortable reading this to anybody else, and
Yep.
I don't want to keep it laying around where somebody may do it. What's something that I can do with it? And I've heard it recommended that you take the letter and burn it.
I've heard that too.
And
Yeah.
just essentially, when you do that, you're letting the smoke or the ash just kind of, as it floats away, you're releasing it, and you're letting it go as it floats away. So, maybe that's something that you would consider if you're listening and you're like, I don't know what to do with this piece of paper. Maybe use that as a guide.
Yeah, I think symbolism is big on that. Sometimes that's what it is. So, certainly the symbolism of burning it, you could shred it. Obviously, whatever it is that you think is what for you is what's going to help you be able to release that, so to speak. Yeah, but those letters, I mean, again, I don't recommend that. In most cases, I wouldn't recommend that that those kind of letters are ever read to anybody else, unless it's something where you feel like, like I know somebody who wrote one and was sharing it with their family members based on some things that they didn't feel that they could say. So they wrote it, processed it through, understood what they wanted to say, and then shared it. And again, they're not letting the person have it. They're just sort of, reading it through so they knew how they wanted to word what they wanted to word. And sometimes that's what it is. It's about identifying what you wanted to say, the way you wanted to say it, in a way you didn't feel the other person heard you. Again, that doesn't guarantee the other person is going to respond the way that you hope they will. I mean, that's the risk, I guess, and it is that, anytime you're in a relationship with anybody it's human, particularly, there's a risk, because you have to be vulnerable in those moments. And that's where we kind of talked about earlier, like, isolation is a huge piece. If I isolate myself from people, I'm not going to want to risk those moments of healing like that. And again, that's opportunity. Those letters are opportunities for people to be able to understand themselves more clearly.
Yeah, we call that, you mentioned not being able to control the other person. In recovery, we call that your side of the street. So you have to clean your side of the street and do what you can do to improve yourself, but you can't control what your neighbor does with their side of the street or your family member does with their side of the street. And you just have to take care of yourself and make sure your side is clean. And then the rest of it is out of your hands. And that's a hard pill to swallow and a hard thing to accept. So
yeah, I think that's the key word, right? Is accepting it. Because I think a lot of people feel like, why can't I, help them clean their side of the street? When the reality is the fact that, yeah, you can. They're just like, they can't do the same for you, So that's kind of and that is a hard thing to accept.
Yeah. Well, Patrick, we have talked a lot about a lot of different things, and I'm praying that this is helpful to somebody. But what last minute advice, what last note would you give to somebody that's listening that you think may be important to be included on this episode?
One of the things I close a lot of my podcasts with is a quote from a Switchfoot song called Always. And one of the lines is, every breath is a second chance. And I always feel like that's a great space to kind of close these things on, because, the reality is the fact that, God, as long as we're breathing, we have a second chance. Any of these things we talked about today, but certainly the ability to be able to continue to return to him, and he's going to be our strength and our stability. And I can say that, and you can hear that, and you can go, yep, that's, I agree with that 100%. But the practice of that is something where it's a lot more difficult. And that's really where, we talk about, faith in a very general sense, but that's really where the truest of faith it is that you're living day by day by God, not by what you can see in front of you. I say that because I'm saying that to myself as equally as hopefully everyone listening to that. But it's a big part of that process of knowing that we're never too far gone. We've never sinned too much. We've been in a position where if we repent and we turn toward God, he's willing and just to forgive us. And the Bible guarantees that. And in my life, I've seen that as well, that, he's never too far away from me. And no matter what I feel, it's not really about what my feelings are. It's about what his consistency is. And he's far more consistent than I am. So I think that's a space where I was trying to lead people with that hope that you always have another opportunity as long as you have a choice and there's breath in your lungs.
So Patrick, I appreciate you being with us today and sharing your insight and your expertise and just sharing some practical tips that our listeners or my listeners can take away. And I pray that those things will be a blessing to them as they continue down their journey of becoming unmasked. So thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was a great conversation. And the same, I hope that everyone out there is blessed by these conversations, and it starts to move them toward one step more of bringing that mask down.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining me today on Unmasked. If this episode encouraged you, would you take a moment to follow, rate, and share it with somebody you think could benefit from hearing it? For more encouragement and information on having me speak at your church or events and my coaching services, visit wesleyfarnsworth.com. And don't forget to connect with me on social media. Until next time, remember that grace is greater than your past, and freedom begins when we live unmasked. God bless you.